Hi everyone, it's Professor Rust. I wanted to take a little time to walk you through one of the articles that we're reading for this week in Social Justice and American Reform Movements. And so I selected Kevin Bales' article from Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy, published in 1999. What I really like about this is how it gives us a mirror to look back upon the other articles and documents in this chapter on the history of the abolitionist movement. And since it's such a relatively recent article in history, I find it to be really fascinating in terms of what it reveals to us about our current situation. It's not just grounded in our American experience, but in a globalization of the world and its entire economy. So here is the sort of the introduction: is that Kevin Bales has disguised himself in the role of a slave trader in order to liberate slaves. So he says, because of his work, governments and people talk about slavery and not slave-like practices. So Bales is the world-leading expert on contemporary slavery and the president of Free the Slaves, the U.S. sister organization of the Anti-Slavery International, the world's oldest human rights organization. And so he has been sort of leading the way in terms of his voice on waking people up to the fact that slavery still exists in the world. And here in the introduction, it points to some pretty interesting statistics. His were the first to estimate the problem's extent, that there are 27 million slaves alive today, most likely half enslaved from freedom and half in hereditary slavery. Slavery is no longer racialized except in Mauritania, he notes, though race, caste, tribe, and religion do initially look like markers of slavery, just as people vulnerable to slave traders and prey on the vulnerable. So he's basically waking us up to the fact that slavery is no longer a racial caste system like it was in the United States, but that it exists in many different forms, in differences of class, in differences of language, in differences of region. He says, this new slavery therefore bears little comparison with 19th century slavery. In addition, while an Alabama slave cost $1,000 to $200 in 1850, the equivalent of $40,000 today, a Mali farm worker now costs $40. Today's slaves are disposable, and that's where the title of the book comes from, Disposable People. Nevertheless, he is an abolitionist in his tradition. He says, we're in a better position than earlier abolitionists. We don't have to win moral arguments or even economic arguments. Slavery is worth just $13 billion a year. There's no legal argument to be won. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees that no one shall be held in slavery. So the task of contemporary abolitionists, it says here, is to raise awareness. It's true that Americans don't want to believe modern-day slavery is occurring, he observes, but in fact, Americans end up being more willing than Europeans to engage in the issue because it resonates with their history of slavery, right? So in that sense, we all have to kind of wake up to the fact that we're probably all benefiting from slavery in one way or another. And what I like, too, is how he also brings in some history. In this document, we're going to see voices from other documents we've read in this chapter. So next is this document here, and let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger for us. He says, slavery is not a horror safely consigned to the past. Right here. Slavery is not a horror. Oh, that's the wrong one. Slavery is not a horror that is safely confined to the past. It continues to exist throughout the world, even in developed countries like France and the United States. Across the world, slaves work and sweat and build and suffer. Right? He talks about slaves in the Caribbean, slaves in Pakistan, and they're paid nothing. He goes on, and this is where we're all going to see our own reliance on slavery. It touches your life indirectly as well. They made the bricks for the factory that made the TV you watch. The Brazil slaves made the charcoal that tempered the steel that made the springs in your car and the blade in your lawnmower. Slaves grew the rice that fed the woman, that wove the lovely cloth you've put up as curtains. Your investment portfolio and your mutual fund pensions own stock in companies using slave labor in the developing world. Slaves keep your costs low and your returns on your investments high. So in that sense, we all have to put ourselves in the position of the people who would have heard the speakers in the earlier parts of this chapter, people who read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, people who listened to Frederick Douglass and his condemnation of the 4th of July, because nothing has changed. In a sense, we are still sitting on the sidelines, willing to accept the benefits of a brand new iPhone while turning our heads and not paying attention to the fact that it's being built by slave labor in China. So, modern slavery hides in different masks, he says right here. Let me underline that for us. Modern slavery hides behind different masks using clever lawyers and legal smokescreens, but when we strip the lies away, we find someone controlled by violence and denied all their personal freedom to make money for someone else. You know, something to consider too is that this is basically a linguistic exercise, and that we don't talk about slavery so much as we talk about globalization, right? Globalization sounds much nicer than modern day slavery. And we also don't talk about slavery within the United States. We talk about human trafficking. And what is human trafficking but modern day slavery? And human trafficking is often associated with sex crimes or prostitution, child sex rings, things like that. But it doesn't have to be that complex. It doesn't have to be that dark and evil. It can be as simple as the person waiting on you in a restaurant who may be working there against their will because back home in the country they've come from, someone might be threatening their family if they don't work in a restaurant owned by a connection. It could be just that simple. The next time you get Uber Eats delivered to your door, think about maybe what that person is doing it for, and don't just think that they're doing it for the money. The next page, he goes into more depth, and let me make this a little bit bigger for us as well. He goes into a little more depth about how it works, right? He says, I first encountered the vestiges of old slavery when I was 4 years old, right here. That happens to be one of my strongest memories. It was in the 1950s when in the American South, and my family was having dinner in a cafeteria. Right? He talks about here, I unhooked the chain and said, you were here first, you should go ahead. But the father of this African-American family looked down at me with eyes full of feeling, and just as my father came up and put his hand on my shoulder, suddenly the atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotion, tensions mixed with bittersweet approval as both fathers grappled with the innocent child, ignorance of a child who had never heard of segregation. No one spoke until finally the black father said, that's okay, we're waiting on someone, go ahead. Right? It can be that simple, right? It doesn't have to be that blatant. It doesn't have to be, riots in the streets and protests in order for us to wake up and see it in front of us. It could be as simple as the person who is handling your laundry at the laundromat or the dry cleaners. It could be as simple as the person driving your Uber when they pick you up in front of your house. It could just be that simple, right? So he goes on here to talk about other examples of slavery that might go on today, right? He says, my best estimate is the number of slaves in the world today is 27 million, right? And of course, this was 1999, so these numbers may have changed since then. He says the range is as high as 200 million, but I feel the number I feel I can trust is 27 million. The biggest part of the 27 million, perhaps 10 to 15 million, is represented by bonded labor in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. Bonded labor or debt bondage happens when people give themselves into slavery as security against a loan or when they inherit a debt from a relative. Otherwise, slavery tends to be more concentrated in Southeast Asia, Northern and Western Africa, and parts of South America. But there are some slaves in almost every country in the world, including the United States, Japan, and European countries. Let's underline that, because that, of course, speaks directly to our experience. Yes, there are slaves in this country today. So he says, put another way, today's slave population is greater than the population of Canada, right? He says, everyone knows what slavery is, yet almost no one knows. The old slavery is much a part of human history and our shared understanding. And everyone knows that sort of slavery was abolished long ago. It is something about which we might feel guilty or angry, and is also a little smug and superior. It is this terrible ignorance that leads us to overlook suffering and death. We couldn't be more wrong if we believed that because the Black Death ended in the Middle Ages, we don't have to worry about epidemics anymore. Well, I think we can all say we do have to worry about epidemics. So here on this next page, he kind of goes into an explanation of what he's talking about here, right? He says, we are seeing the beginning of a new abolitionist movement, right? So he's bringing the movement to today, right? Many people in developed countries don't want, many people in developing countries feel good about the fact that slavery was abolished back then and are shocked and disappointed that it will have to be abolished all over again. In fact, the work to be done today doesn't diminish the achievement of 19th century abolitionists one bit. They fought to stop legal slavery and they won that fight. We must stop illegal slavery, right? So let's underline that, because that is where the movement continues right there. Now, what I love about this next part is he's actually quoting directly and referencing specifically Frederick Douglass, which we read as a part of this the readings for this week. He says, Douglass was an escaped slave from the southern states who became a leader in the fight for abolition. And perhaps the people who were listening to that speech in Rochester, New York, expected to compare America's great tradition of liberty to the rule of European kings and tyrants. They were in for a surprise. So he says he expected that Douglass was not invited to the barbecue that followed, right? Because he poured into the ears of his audience biting ridicule and sarcasm, beneath which lay a single simple question. If there are still slaves, how can you be proud of your freedom? And if that really should be a question for us today, right? If there still be slaves, how can we parade around and talk about freedom and patriotism and be proud of this country, which still continues to employ slave labor today? Are we willing, he says, are we willing to live in a world with slaves? And if not, we are obligated to take responsibility for the things that are connected to us, even when far away. Now, this is where the connection to self comes in, right? He's already laid out the difference between the blueprint and the reality. He's created that revolutionary language about talking about the number of slaves in the world. And he's also invited us to be a part of a community of literature when he brings in Frederick Douglass. But here is where he brings it back to us, a connection to self. Are we able to really say that we are better than the people who owned slaves in the 19th century if we are benefiting from slavery ourselves? And suddenly the hypocrisy that Frederick Douglass was talking about applies to us as well. Now, what's amazing is that this type of bravery, and it is bravery, it's a call for brave action, is one that we really have to ask ourselves, especially in this season, in this state of California, as we are watching the wildfires burning out of control. And why are the wildfires so bad this year? Why are they so strong? Because the slave labor that we have employed in years past is not available this year. The slave labor is the convict labor in prisons that are used to put out the fires, but because of COVID, the prisons have been emptied and the firefighters have been sent home, and now we are unable to put out the fires with the same resources that we have grown accustomed to. And our lives are now in danger as a result. Our homes are now in danger as a result. And so we need to think that it's right there in front of us every day. The convict slave labor, the prison complex, is a prison slavery complex that has always been designed to supply this country with a disposable people who could serve the needs of the society for a very, very low price when called upon. And we need to ask ourselves if we're willing to pay the price for emancipation, or if we're happy owning slaves by other names. So, short and sweet. I just wanted to walk you through that, and hopefully that helps. Hopefully these connections and elements of protest literature give you some ideas on how to use this text if you choose to do so in your upcoming essays or personal projects. So thank you for listening, and take care.